Barbara Kellerman is a longtime Westport resident. She's the founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's been a member of the Harvard faculty for over 20 years after teaching at other schools, including Fordham, Tufts, George Washington, Dartmouth, and Maryland. She was awarded 3 Fulbright fellowships and is the author of many books on presidents and leadership. Barbara has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, many other papers, and appeared on CBS, NBC, PBS, CNN, NPR, MSNBC, and the BBC. She's spoken to audiences in Berlin, Moscow, Australia, Argentina, Korea, Brazil, and Japan. And her newest book is Leadership from Bad to Worse: What Happens When Bad Festers. Barbara is here, and we will talk today about leadership. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you very much. It sounds, first of all, like I can't hold a job, mentioning the different institutions. And second of all, yes, I've spoken all over the world, but never directly with you. Although indirectly, we've known each other for like 5 minutes, or 5 years, or maybe 15, 20 years.
It's been great. So I read that laundry list of appearances, and Fox was not on it.
Oh, you've noticed. You're not supposed to notice that. When I started doing this, Fox wasn't even Fox. So I've been doing this for many years. I do speak all over the world, but I tend to be fairly direct in my comments, and sometimes critical. I even bite the hand that feeds me, which I call the leadership industry, because that's really what I do. All my books virtually, without exception, touch on leadership and followership, matters of power and authority in the United States, but also globally. And I'm a political scientist, so primarily political leadership, but by no means exclusively. Just blogged. I'm a regular blogger, a 5-part series on campus leadership. I'm interested in corporate leadership, so I cut across the board.
And Fox doesn't like that.
They don't seem to like it, at least not recently.
So very timely. We're in the midst of an important national election, and a few days ago, a former leader who is running to be a leader again became a convicted felon, in part because of what he tried to do to become a leader the first time around. So how do you assess the state of leadership in America today?
How many hours do we have, Dan? I could go on about this, as you can imagine. So to make it quite quick, I think, one of the things to be said is that when we say leadership, people typically focus on the person at the top. That is really not the way to understand it. Yes, the person at the top matters. In this case, you're talking about Donald Trump. Obviously, he's been a central figure in our heads and in our national life for now almost 10 years, not quite. But the way to understand him is not just by looking at him. You need to look at what I call followers, that is his constituents, his supporters, his acolytes, even people who are bystanders who do not participate in politics. So you need to look at the larger group of people who might or might not support him. And you also need to look at the moment in time. 2024 is not like 2014, not like 2004. This country has changed. The global context has changed. So it is leadership and followership are very different now from what they were even 10 years ago, not to speak of a generation ago. The only thing I'll add now is that the problems that we're talking about, domestic, are echoed, reflected globally in democracies worldwide. So very quickly, in Britain, as you may or may not know, they used to have prime ministers that lasted a decade or so. Now they last 3 years. That's a lot. Liz Truss lasted 6 weeks, and Rishi Sunak, who thought he'd be around for a bit, he called a premature election I think it was last week. So again, the problems that afflict, the leadership problems that afflict the United States are not confined only to our democracy, but to democracies globally.
So are leaders born or made?
You know, that's one of my students' favorite questions. The answer is yes and yes. So I don't know if you've ever played a musical instrument. Let's say you've taken piano lessons, you or me.
My mother was a piano teacher.
Oh, she was. Well, I'm asking
And
the
I
right
never
person
took.
then. Well, that says a lot. We'll get into that in another conversation. So I'm particularly musically not gifted. If I took piano lessons, and there's a lot of leadership training and leadership education, leadership this and leadership that out there. If I took piano lessons, I could be an okay pianist. Would I ever be an exceptional pianist? Never in a million years. So I guess what I'm saying, Dan, is can you learn to be a leader? Can you learn to be a better leader than you already are? Probably, although the evidence on that is skimpy. The measurements are poor. But are you going to become Martin Luther King Jr.? I kind of doubt it. And I similarly kind of doubt, in fact, I know that someone like Martin Luther King Jr. never took a leadership course. So yes, leaders are born. And can they also, to a degree, be made? Yes, but don't get carried away with making. Think of it as a natural gift.
You either have it or you don't.
You either have it or you don't. Yes.
So if you're not a leader, then are you automatically a follower? Or is there some liminal space in between?
There is a liminal space in between. It's often a semantic issue because in English, the obverse of leader is follower. There's no other antonym. However, most followers, or I shouldn't say most, I should say some followers don't follow. So what do you do? What is the nomenclature on that? I mean, we could go to extreme cases of Nazi Germany where there are long conversations. In fact, the field of followership or the issue, the question of why people follow particularly bad leaders came to the fore in the wake of World War II, where in particular, American social scientists, some of them emigres from Europe, Jewish emigres from Europe, asked aloud and studied the question of how can so many ostensibly, or could have so many ostensibly good Germans have followed a leader like Hitler, which of course millions and millions of Germans did. So the issue of followership, which interests me endlessly, is by and large neglected by the leadership industry, but I think its importance cannot be overestimated.
And I have to ask about, since you introduced the Nazi analogy, much has been said and written about the fact that we could be headed toward a similar type of situation in terms of people following a leader who says he's going to be authoritarian, who is in fact campaigning on that idea. How does that happen?
It happens the way I just indicated, which is that he has a base. Think of that base as followers in the literal sense. No matter so far, this could change tomorrow morning, but so far, virtually no matter what Donald Trump, to whom you're obviously referring, virtually nothing he has said and virtually nothing he has done has shifted people who are hardcore believers, supporters. By the way, they're the key to the Trump era. Trump is, again, as I said earlier, you can look at Trump and try to understand what's happening, but if you really want to understand what's happening in the United States of America, look at his base, because it is the base, the Republican base, that has compelled all the Republican elites, particularly, most obviously, I should say, members of Congress, to kowtow to the former president, because they are beholden to the base, lest they lose office. It is the base, along with Trump, better than any other single thing that explains the phenomenon of Trump. But again, to your question, there are all kinds of reasons that people support bad followers. Sometimes they want money, sometimes they want power, sometimes they make them feel secure. In the early days in particular, Donald Trump was really an entertainer. He was, after all, if you go back to 2015, 2016, a TV personality. Interestingly, Donald Trump had no government experience, no government expertise. and yet he was an immense attraction from day one. So people follow leaders, they follow bad leaders as well as good ones for a host of personal reasons, and Trump remains, particularly to white American males, a strong attraction. Why that is, we could analyze separately, but that is the more than females and more than African Americans or people of other races. It is the white American male that has constituted the core, not the only, but the core of his constituency from day one.
You have spent a lot of time at universities with young people. As you look at young people and leadership, and a lot of people have said that this is a generation that's grown up collaborating on everything in school and everything that they do. What do you see as you look ahead in terms of those generations, young generations, and leadership?
So we've just been through since October 7th. The only reasons it's quiet now, I would argue, is because it's already summer break. To your question about young people, we have been through a period of considerable campus unrest in response to the war in Gaza, obviously. This is hardly the first time we've had campus unrest. I think you and I, but I'll speak for myself, are old enough to remember the late 60s and early 70s, a period during which, primarily because of the Vietnam War, this was endemic. But I have written about how students respond to authority, in particular me, because I see it in the classroom. And I'll give you my quintessential example. When I started teaching, and until, let's say, 10 years ago, students would invariably call me maybe Dr. Kellerman or alternatively Professor Kellerman. Now they call me, even if I've never met them before, Barbara. So what does this do? It sounds trivial, but it is not. It is an example of the decline of the value of expertise. As soon as they call me Barbara, I'm more or less on their level. If I give them a grade they don't like, they will complain about it. If the assignment is too difficult, they will complain about it. The classroom is a microcosm of what has happened in this country, but again, in the Western world more generally, which is that people ostensibly without power, students in the old days, they were relatively powerless, now confront power in a way that we're not used to. By the way, we can go through experts across the board. In the old days, if a doctor said, take a blue pill, you would blindly take a blue pill. Now they say, take a blue pill, you go online. Most people say, take a pink pill, and you're going to go back to the doctor and complain, what the hell are you telling me to take a blue pill for, if most people are saying, take a pink pill. So this is across the board, which is why I say leadership has changed, followership has changed, and the context within which we're embedded has changed.
Is there an upside to that?
You know, had you asked, it's a great question, Dan. Had you asked me this 10, 20 years ago, the rote answer would have been, yes, we're more democratic. We want democracy. We've seen it since the Enlightenment, people have struggled for more power. We've seen it in the 19th century, freedom of slaves, freedom of serfs. In the 20th century, women can vote. In the 60s and 70s, civil rights and women's rights. Oh, how great, amazing. Power is being more equally distributed. However, as you said, I've written many books. One of the books I wrote is titled The End of Leadership, came out about 10 years ago. And in it, I kind of prognosticated what was happening correctly. What I did not, I think, then fully understand is that if this gets carried to an extreme, we have disorder. What happens when we have disorder? People basically they want it. I want power. The heck with the person up at the top of the hierarchy. But if we have too much disorder, people don't like it. They feel, Freud made this point. He said people have a thirst for authority. If we have too much disorder, the tendency is to turn, and we see this worldwide, the upswing in appeal of right-wing people and right-wing parties, because we tend to turn to strong men when we feel that the more traditional liberal leaders cannot contain the vox populi. So we say we want power, but if we have too much of it, leading to what we perceive as disorder, doesn't make us happy either.
So we've been talking about power in a global sense, president and prime minister, and you mentioned men. Let's talk about Westport. Is leadership in a town like ours of 27,000 people, with the 3 people at the top, the 3 select women being women, is power different and power and leadership different in a town like ours than in a country like ours?
So you've touched on several different issues. One, are women different kinds of leaders from men? That's one issue you touched on. Another one is, of course, the town in particular. Westport, as we earlier discussed, is it's a fortunate town. It's a relatively wealthy town. It's a lovely town on the water with woods and so forth and so on. So people are inclined to be happy here. At the same time, you know this better than I, much better than I, Dan. Debates have become more rancorous in the recent past. They are reflecting not only ordinary people who say, I don't want my first selectman to tell me what to do. I don't want any committee making a decision for me, not in my backyard. They reflect, this is what I talk about when I talk about follower power. They're growing bolder than they were. They're increasingly emboldened. They're feeling increasingly entitled. They don't want to be told what to do. Up to a point, that's contributory and interesting. But again, I don't have to tell you, even in a town like Westport, if it goes too far so that the governors, broadly speaking, cannot properly govern, it's not good for anyone, least of all the future of the town.
And again, these are social, societal trends. What causes it? Why are people here more rancorous than they have been in the past? What has brought us to this point?
The typical answer, if you look at the person in the street, they would say Donald Trump. He's meaner, he's coarser, he's more argumentative, he does things that are corrupt or illegal. And I would argue, yes, Trump matters, but to suggest that he's some kind of aberration is missing the point. An interesting thought experiment would be if we suddenly removed Trump from the political picture, would Trumpism vanish? A world in which manners have seemed to go out the window, where technology, we haven't touched on technology, but I cannot emphasize enough the importance of technology, particularly social media, on the interaction between leaders and followers. Look, technology emboldens and makes it possible for people like you and me, ordinary people, to complain bitterly about everything. Often people are anonymous, in which case they can be mean and coarse and even violent in ways that in a previous generation would be unthinkable. So if I had to pin down the 2 reasons why people in Westport, as all over the country, are meaner, coarser, ruder, culturally different from what they were, I would say, number 1, the contextual changes to which I've alluded, and number 2, the advent of technology, which makes access to a megaphone, a quaint word, far easier, far faster than it used to be. And it makes us behave in ways we would have thought unthinkable a generation ago.
As I see every day in the comments on my blog.
By the way, Dan, I'm going to reverse this for a minute. Do you feel that Westport in 2024 is different from Westport 10 years ago in terms that people are lovely, and if we meet people across the country one-to-one, Americans I'm talking about, are really nice. And it's almost hard to believe that we see this much bad behavior, but we do. And you're suggesting that some of the comments that you're getting and behaviors you're seeing are in fact somewhat different.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. As we were talking about earlier before we began this, the people who've come here in the last 3 years, 4 years, the COVID people, came here for the right reasons. They were looking for community. They Westport is beyond their expectations. They love the town. They love the people. They love the beauty. They love the restaurants, the beach. They go on and on. And at the same time, they are quicker to criticize about something that involves them, not their neighbor, or it's all about me. And it's almost a dichotomy.
Yeah.
I think back to, all of a sudden I've become the interviewee, but I think back to when my parents moved here in the 1950s, and they changed the town rapidly, they and their generation, with new buildings and new homes. And, it was no longer the old Yankee artist colony that it had been. And as far as I know, no matter what the people who lived here thought, they all got along, and the town evolved. I think the town will continue to evolve, but there certainly is an undercurrent of unease or malcontent, whatever you want to call it.
That did not previously exist.
Correct.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. So you can imagine, Dan, if it's happening in a place like Westport, as you just said, so well endowed, so blessed, it is happening nationally. The fractiousness that we read about is real. The meanness and crudeness that we read about is real. And I'll just add one thing. The number of democracies, there's an organization called Freedom House. You may have heard of it. Some people have. It's a nonprofit organization that tracks democracies and autocracies around the world. For almost 20 years, the numbers of democracies has declined, while the numbers of autocracies has gone on the rise. So Westport is its own bubble, its own town, its own dynamic. But to understand Westport, you need to put it in the context of the country within which it's embedded, which itself needs to be put in the larger global context within which democracy, for some of the reasons that we're talking about, partly people just can't accept that it entails responsibility as well as rights, democracies are in trouble. So again, if Westport were to further exaggerate trends that we've seen, this would not be good for the town. I think we understand that. So it behooves every citizen of Westport, as I believe it behooves every citizen of the United States, to understand what they owe their town and their country, not just what it owes them.
The John F. Kennedy quote.
Yes.
So, Professor, what is the solution?
Dan, we're talking here not about widgets. We're talking about human beings. So while I have harped on, referenced several times over, things change. Leaders are different. Followers are different. The context is different. In some fundamental way, things don't change. When you talk about leadership, you need to be able to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. So for the answer to your question, let's go back to Shakespeare. Play like Julius Caesar, which had heroes, but very, very complicated heroes. Human beings, again, are not widgets. We are not, there are no easy solutions to what you're describing. Needless to say, I have some ideas on what needs to be done. For example, civic education, which by and large is out the window in this country. So there are some long-term solutions, but since we're talking about human beings, are there quick fixes?
So we've talked, and this has been fascinating and enlightening and frightening all at the same time. We've talked basically about political leaders, but there are many other kinds. And here in Westport, we have financial leaders, we have entrepreneurial leaders, leaders of large companies. Your grandsons are sports leaders. They're captains of their teams. Or how does that type of leadership fit in with what we've been talking about for the past half hour?
Dan, it fits in perfectly. There is no leader in business who will disagree with the kinds of things I said, who will say, oh, it's easier to lead in 2024 than it was 10 and 20 years ago. Any leader, any corporate business leader will tell you what I've told you. It's harder. their employees, their stockholders, their boards. They're much more cantankerous than they used to be, harder for them to lead and manage. And by the way, even the military, where we have this notion of command and control and so forth and so on, every person in the military that I've ever spoken to, which is a number because I've been at the Kennedy School a long time, there are some military people there, they will also say, you need to now explain to your underlings why you're telling them to do what you want them to do. In the old days, we would just tell them. Now they're going, excuse me, why should we be doing that? It is much harder. Every single thing I've said, Dan, applies across the board. And I will give you one wonderful example. As I don't have to tell you, in the wake of the pandemic, employers generally said to their employees, okay, kind of the worst is over here. It's time for you to get back into the office. By the way, kindly get back into the office 5 days a week, 7 or 8 hours a day. Guess what people said? No, boss, I'm not going to do that. So many people, office workers in particular, said that. The whole thing became known as the Great Resignation. And we now have, and Westport can testify to this, a permanent change in the nature of the work week for office hours called hybrid. Was this the leader's idea? It was not. It was the followers. It was not the employer. It was the employee that demanded and ultimately got a hybrid work week.
Which is now why we have people at the YMCA at noon.
Exactly.
And picking up their kids from school at 3 and contributing to traffic and to this nice vibe of hanging out at Gigi and Joe's.
Exactly. And by the way, as you know, it also means countless other social and economic changes, whether it's downtowns that we're newly worried about, particularly since we live near New York, but also people are moving further out than Westport. I don't have to worry about moving 2 hours away from New York City because I now only have to go in 2 days a week and not 5. So it has led to a huge change pushed by people at the bottom, followers, ordinary people, most certainly not by people at the top, leaders.
Amazing. This is great. I have one last question.
Yep.
Before we were talking, and you said you had spent the better part of 40 years away from Westport during the work week, teaching. So now that you're here and sort of re-engaging with the town, any message to Westporters that you want to give?
Yeah, I said to Dan a moment ago earlier that I have been gone for much of the last. Westport has been my base for over 50 years, but because I've worked elsewhere, I would live elsewhere for about half the week. So in the wake of the pandemic, I left Harvard, I retired, and I have become reacquainted with Westport. Yes, it is, as you said earlier, a spectacularly wonderful town. We are so blessed, but that also means, and this is my message to anybody who cares to listen, we do, as I said earlier, have a responsibility, which is to try to get along with each other, to be civil, to be collaborative and cooperative when those virtues seem to be sometimes in short supply.
Great words of wisdom from Professor Barbara Kellerman. Thank you for being on 06880, the podcast, and thank you for leading us wherever we may go.
And thank you for not calling me Babs.
Who knew? Thanks again.
Thank you.